Hi, let me give you a quick overview of the Symposium Transition Strategies for Sustainable Community Systems from Design and Systems Perspective, that is scheduled during 19th to 20th of January 2017 in the beautiful city of Bhubaneswar in India. This brief includes 4 aspects, the first being the rationale behind the symposium, the second the postulates underlying the design and systems perspective in terms of nature of relationship and state of relationships in the society, the third being the major dimensions and variables of relationships and the dynamics of relationships and possible lock-in processes, and the fourth of course is to identify potential areas of research to unlock sustainability, to be able to inform policy formulations for sustainability. Coming to the first one, let us look at the rationale behind the tracks, topics, their boundaries in terms of design thinking and systems perspective, and how all these have evolved. Hope this will help you give a better focus to the articles, cases, and policy analysis that you intend to submit to this symposium. Many of the senior members of the advisory committee of this symposium have been working on various topics of this symposium for over 30 years now. My own engagement in this domain has been for about 2 decades. During the last 10 years, the focus however has been sharper on these tracks and topics. The various deductive and inductive studies, engaging action research and involvement in policy formulations presents a compelling need to understand the lock-in mechanisms of our designs and systems that hinder sustainability. And accordingly, we have chosen these topics for discussion during the symposium. So, coming to the second issue of the basic postulates, the nature of relationship is more of the understanding that we have today is that there is interconnection and interdependence in the society. And one can look at the working of a clock to understand these interconnections and interdependencies. The connection between the seconds, minute and the hour hand can indicate the nature of interconnections. But the reality could be much more complex, and you can see as in this interconnected gears the depth of interconnection that we have in the society. And in actual reality of our society, it could be a high level of interconnections across time and space, as you can see here in this slide. But what is our state of relationship across space and time as of today? We can see these few slides to understand the interconnections and the state of relationships that we have today. There is a growing inequality, and there is enough of work which suggests that there is growing inequality. The best that we have today of course is Thomas Piketty's study, the World Bank reports, which show that there has been global inequality that has been rising for the last about 190 years, and the Gini coefficient is increasing during this period. If you look at the income inequality in emerging countries, it's much more starker, and you can see for instance the example of India here in this slide, that it has been low during the time of from the time of around 1950s to 1980s, when we were a social economy. Subsequent to 1980s, when we have started liberalizing, the inequality Gini coefficient has increased for India during this period. We often put this away as development paradox, but we have to discover why this happens and what are the causes for these kind of inequalities. Now, given these kind of inequality, this is just about income inequality, but if you look at the wealth inequality is much more starker. And now, given this kind of relations, the state of relationship, we need to understand whether we can really progress forward. And of course, the best of this goes back to what I can see from Rousseau's argument in 1762 in his book The Social Contract, when he said, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. One man thinks himself the master of others, but remains more of a slave than they are." And you can see here the description, the way he has described the nature of man. And this is just not the last 200 years of observation. Rousseau goes back to more than 300 years to suggest these kind of ideas that this were happening, this kind of inequality did exist even 300, 400 years ago. And more of that is captured in the kind of chakra view that we have in our myths and stories that we have been writing, and the various labyrinths across the world that goes back to over 4,000 years, that these fears of control, these fears of subjugation has always been there in the history of mankind. And today's control mechanisms, it may not be just on physical or material controls, but it could be psychological or mental control. And so therefore, in these kind of this state of relationship that we have today, can we really achieve sustainability? And we of course have the beautiful and noble objectives under the Sustainable Development Goals. As you see in these slides, there are 17 goals to transform our world. These are all noble objectives, but given the nature of relationship and the current state of relationships that we have and we have had in the past, can we really achieve sustainability? Given these constraints and situations, the research for us has been in trying to identify the major dimensions of our relationships and the potential lock-in in these dimensions. And the dimensions that we encounter, and you can see in these slides, are the dimensions of production systems that we have, which includes primary, secondary and tertiary production. Although in our research we have focused primarily on the production in the primary sector, in the agricultural sector. And then the second dimension is the dimensions of organizations, the kind of organizations we have to manage these various sectors. And the third, of course, is the issues of institutions that we have built around or managing these organization and building the relationships among these organizations. In addition, we also have these issues of governance, which needs to be also looked at, how these are developed, what mechanisms are developed on governance, and not miss out on the very important dimension, that's the transrational dimensions, which may not have a rational explanation, but they do have significant impact on the way we relate to each other. Now, this slide of course will give you a quick view of the various variables for each of these dimensions that I just mentioned, and there are here you can quickly have a look at these variables and the associated dimensions that we have. Now, the question is the understanding the dynamics of relationships, and as an illustration, let me show you this the dynamics of relationships in organization, and taking these 5 variables of size, scope, technology, ownership and management. Now, each of these is a very interesting dimension, and this is true of any organization, whether the organization is the primary sector or secondary sector or in the tertiary sector. As you increase the size, the scope of activities of the organization typically tends to be smaller. As the size and scope, so in other words, as the size increases, the firm tends to become specialized. As it tends to become specialized, it cannot, but it has to rely on technology. So, the technology intensification takes place in the organization. And as the technology intensification takes place or is required, it does not come free. It requires huge investments, and these investments are to be invested by some owners. So, the ownership structure also gets modified, or ownership becomes concentrated. So, as all these 4 shift towards one side of the spectrum, towards one end of the spectrum, the size increases, this specialization increases, technology investment intensifies, and the ownership also gets concentrated, you cannot but have to have a very complex management structure to reduce transaction costs. And these are all interconnected. So, the change can happen at any point. The technology can intensify, and that would lead to subsequent changes in specialization and size of the organization and the ownership, or the ownership can get concentrated and it can influence the other variables. These 5 dimensions can determine the direction in which the organization goes, and typically we see that when the size grows, specialization increases, technology intensifies, ownerships get concentrated and management complex, you have a typical kind of organization called the large multinational corporations. On the other hand, when these are on the other end of the spectrum, as you see in the slide here, you will find a smaller organization like the SHGs, small self-help groups that we find in typical agricultural sector in India. Now, we know that the SHG groups are, while they are good social units, but they are not technically feasible. On the other hand, large corporations from my 20 years of work on this, and many more scholarships who have worked on this, would tend to suggest that they seem to be unsustainable in the future. So, the question is about how do we find optimal positions of these design variables to make organizations sustainable for future. But what I want to impress on is that these variables are interconnected and they influence each other in a manner which drives the organization in a particular way. And do we have a clear understanding on how do we design organizations? Now, this is only talking about one dimension organization, the variables associated to organizations. Similarly, if you take the other dimensions, the relationships could be much complex. And you can see here in this slide that the number of variables, if you put them together, the complexity of our system, the designs in the systems become immense for us to imagine what's going on. And we really are not able to possibly understand how we are becoming unsustainable over time. So, the complex control mechanisms actually come in play, and what determines is the nature of intent that drives each of these variables, each of these dimensions and variables to lead us to a situation where we possibly become more unsustainable. Therefore, the question that we need to ask is, are our own designs and systems perpetuating control and lock-in effects on us that we may not be aware of? And have we done enough research on understanding these dynamics and the consequences on our sustainability? Given these, in summary, therefore, the symposium tries to capture all these points, and it's a single story to look into. And here, this slide presents to you the overall summary that I just mentioned in the last few minutes. And if you want to know more about this symposium, please visit our website of NABARD Chair Unit in the Xavier University, Bhubaneswar. You can take the reference from the slides here to get to the web link and get more information on that. Thank you so much.